Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
David Cameron hopes to reach a final deal on renegotiation at the next EU summit in February. This could pave the way for a referendum as early as June. But September is also a possibility, as is a vote in early 2017. There are a number of tricky issues still to be addressed. Crucially, David Cameron has to reach an agreement with the rest of the 28 states that make up the European Union. This is easier said than done. EU President Donald Tusk says member states are far from agreement on several topics. Some of the Prime Minister's demands, such as banning EU migrants from receiving in-work tax credits for 4 years, are proving particularly controversial. But assuming David Cameron reaches a deal, the BBC expects cabinet ministers to be allowed to campaign to leave the EU if they find it unsatisfactory. The Justice Secretary, Michael Gove, and Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond have both said they would be prepared to vote no. Home Secretary Theresa May has also left the door open to backing the Leave campaign. Then there's the Prime Minister. Will he have to resign if Britain votes to leave the EU after leading the campaign to stay in? The Labour Party say they will make the case for continued membership of the EU, whatever the outcome of David Cameron's renegotiation. But they won't whip MPs to support their party's line, so there's potential for shadow cabinet splits too. Well, let's speak now to BBC 5 Live's chief political correspondent, John Pienaar. John, why has this happened now? Why the announcement so early in the year?
Well, David Cameron's really just following through, Joe, on promises that he's been giving in private to senior Eurosceptic colleagues for some while now. I don't think he realistically had any choice but to take this step. In fact, I think it would have been a bigger shock and a bigger story if he decided not to do it. Now, why is that? Because if he tried, I think, David Cameron, to keep all of his ministers in line, batting in favour of continued membership, whatever happens in these negotiations, there was a very real risk of multiple resignations. We'd be looking at the likes of Ian Duncan-Smith and Chris Grayling. You've mentioned others there who would be part of that speculation, and it could all unravel and blow up very, very quickly. Now, the Tory party and David Cameron are going to have a big enough problem keeping his party looking something like coherently united through this entire process. This is dealing with one particular wound before it opens up.
Is this a sign of weakness?
I think it's a sign of realism. He recognises, David Cameron, as I think all of us could see, at pretty much first glance, that there are deep divisions in the Conservative Party. There are differences of view, quite wide ones in the cabinet itself, and this was an accident waiting to happen. There are certainly senior ministers who would campaign, if this is the way they felt, campaign for getting out of Europe, whatever David Cameron said, even if it meant resigning. And so David Cameron has forestalled all of that. Whatever happens after this, of course, David Cameron's got a job to do. If the vote is to get out of the European Union, the question of David Cameron's survival becomes a really live issue. But I think if it goes the other way, there is still a job of reunification to be done, and he didn't need to make that harder than it needed to be.
Do you think some members of the cabinet who may indeed campaign to come out of the EU, do you see any of them leading that campaign now they're being given the freedom to campaign either side?
I guess that remains to be seen. We wait to see who emerges in the front and centre of the out campaign as time goes by. What we will see now are the likes of, potentially in Duncan-Smith, Chris Grayling out there from the moment the deal is signed. And that could happen, Joe, possibly as early as a couple of weeks' time, in February, 6 weeks' time. There may be a deal which is agreed by David Cameron and the other EU leaders, at which point every bet is off and everyone can go their own way. It may not be coherent, but it's the way it was going to go, whatever happened.
John Pienaar, thank you. Well, we're joined now by the UKIP MP Douglas Carswell. Welcome back to the Daily Politics. And Douglas Carswell, are you pleased? I mean, is this a boost? Is this the boost for your campaign?
I'm really pleased. We could be about 6 months away from a referendum. I think we're in with a realistic chance of winning it. There's real momentum now behind the Leave campaign. We start to see a realignment within the Conservative Party with senior figures preparing to come out and campaign to leave. We start to see in the Labour Party people coming out campaigning to leave. We start to see business leaders reported in the Mail on Sunday, opinions shifting voting in favour of leave. I think this is incredibly exciting. We're starting to see that broad-based national coalition to redefine our relationship with Europe. It's very exciting.
Yeah, I mean, Cat Smith, Douglas Carswell has mentioned some big beasts could come out from the Labour Party too. If you've got big figures in the Conservative Party, Ian Duncan Smith, Theresa May, Sajid Javid, all on the airwaves backing an EU exit, it's a big blow to the campaign to stay in the EU.
Well, I think as sure as the sun will rise in the morning, the Conservative Party will always be split on Europe, and Cameron, I admit, was between a rock and a hard place and has had to give his MPs this free vote.
But that's not my question. What will it do to the stay within the EU? Because actually that will, as Douglas Carswell said, give it momentum.
I don't expect, as Douglas says, any big beasts from Labour to be campaigning alongside Douglas in this referendum. I think the Labour Party is very united on this issue.
When I was a Conservative...
There isn't anybody, is there?
When
really
I was a Conservative backbench MP, I got to know Jeremy Corbyn, who was then a backbencher. I got to know him pretty well. Why? Because I kept on bumping into him in the voting lobby every time we voted against the consensus of David Cameron and co on Europe.
Are you seriously saying Jeremy Corbyn is going to vote to come out?
No, but it indicates that there's, on the left, a very ambivalent relationship with a big corporatist cartel in Brussels that rigs the rules against ordinary working people. How can it be, Kat, that the left in this country is putting the interests of bankers ahead of working people in Southern Europe?
No one has said in the Labour Party that the EU is some perfect institution which we fully support. What we're saying is that it's better for British workers to be in the EU than out of the EU.
But you just
because it's through the EU that many of the rights that we've won, from maternity pay, paternity leave, workers' rights if you're tupied over in the workplace, all these rights in the workplace were won
it's ambivalent.
by being part of the EU. We want to reform the EU, absolutely.
What you're getting here is a preview of the debate on the renegotiation, which is going to take place over the months before the referendum. But the really good thing about this is that everyone in our country who's over the age to vote will have a vote, will be able to listen to the arguments that those who are very much against, like Douglas, and those who are very much in favour, like Kat, are putting, and then it was they who will make up their mind, not politicians in Westminster.
Right, and you're also in favour of the UK remaining within the EU, Tommy Shepherd. I mean, there is an assumption repeated by your party that Scotland is overwhelmingly pro-EU and pro the UK staying within the EU. What's your evidence for that?
Well, that's what the polls would seem to suggest. I mean,
the polls are mixed.
Well, the last poll I saw, 72% of people wanted to stay within the EU. Of course, we want reforms within the EU and we want a better EU, but we can do that from a position of being in rather than out. Joe, you asked at the beginning whether or not this was the right decision that David Cameron's going to take today. I think it's the right decision for the Tory party, but the wrong decision for the country. And not for the first time, the Prime Minister is putting his party before the country. I think it's time that he actually showed some leadership in this. He seems to have given up the prospect of getting a deal in these discussions he's having with his European partners that he can get the backing of his own cabinet on. Right. And that seems to me to be a ridiculous position for the Prime Minister to be in before he's even concluded the discussions.
It's been described as thin gruel so far by a backbencher. I mean, what do you say? There isn't enough for those who are already Eurosceptic to actually support.
Well, I don't agree with what Tommy is saying. The fact is that the Prime Minister is an extremely good negotiator. Even his political opponents would give him that. He's a good negotiator.
Well, what are you expecting him to get that he hasn't got so far?
Well, I think you've got to wait till he concludes his negotiations.
In a few weeks.
I worked very closely with him for 7.5 years. He is the most Eurosceptic Prime Minister that I have known in my 30-odd years in politics.
Really?
Yes, and I think that he will get a good deal. And I think that the European Union at the moment is flat on its back. There's never been a less appetising time for the European Union. You look at Greece, you look at the euro, you look at migration, you look at its stagnant economy.
Right.
The fact is that he will have to do a deal which gets Britain into a different place, and I believe he will do.
Right, but if he doesn't, I mean, he wouldn't campaign to come out, would he?
Well, I expect him to be successful on his negotiations. But
could you imagine a position where he could?
This is not a secret negotiation. Everyone is revealing how it's going, and at the end of the day, I expect him to be successful in what he's trying to achieve.
The way you just characterised the EU, and you said he's the most Eurosceptic Prime Minister or Eurosceptic Conservative you've dealt with, would there be a situation where he would campaign to come out?
He is the most Eurosceptic Prime Minister in my 30 years.
And would there be any situation in which he would campaign to pull the
let us wait and see the result of his negotiations. I'm not going to deal with a hypothetical question. But the fact is, I expect him to negotiate a successful deal.
Isn't this pathetic? Here's a historic opportunity to fundamentally renegotiate our relationship with Europe, and instead the negotiations are reduced to trying to say that Polish plumbers aren't allowed to claim in-work benefits. It's pathetic. Come on. We need fundamental renegotiation, like we were led to believe would happen at the time of the Bloomberg speech. It's been watered down and watered down and watered down. And what we see today is a diluted version of a watered down agenda that's never even been seriously attempted.
Douglas is prejudging the negotiations, and it's wrong to do that. He should be uniting
there's not much time left.
He should be uniting behind his former colleagues in the Conservative Party to ensure that the negotiation is successful.
Hang on, well, let's talk about Douglas Carswell and being unified. What's going on with you and Nigel Farage? We've had the season of goodwill, but there's been a spat between the two of you. Has it been resolved?
I made my views clear. I'm
Yes.
not going to articulate them again. I don't think anyone can accuse me of not being frank.
You still want a fresh face as leader?
I was asked before Christmas for my views on UKIP's medium-term strategic direction. I've articulated those views, but this is about the European referendum.
But I'm coming on to that. I'm coming on to that, because does it help if you've got two Leave campaigns to start with? We interviewed Nigel Farage just before Christmas, as I'm sure you know, and he said that you are going to have to put up or shut up.
Well, I'm involved in the Leave campaign, the Vote Leave campaign, and Nigel's involved in the Leave.eu campaign.
And the two of you are at each other's throats.
But it's very sensible for UKIP to be backing both horses in a two-horse race. Look, only one of those campaigns is going to get official designation. Imagine a scenario where the Scottish National Party had, for example, managed to isolate itself from the official independence campaign in the run-up to that referendum. Of course, we want to be involved in both campaigns, but the Electoral Commission will designate one of them, and we want to make sure that we are working closely with the officially designated out campaign.
Have you spoken, though, to Nigel Farage over Christmas and New Year?
I haven't actually spoken to him on the phone. I've communicated with him, but not over the phone, no.
And what's happened? Because he said we cannot have, and I don't think the NEC will allow one individual to give an impression in the country that UKIP is divided, when actually it's very united.
But on the issue of the European referendum, we're very united.
Right.
We
But what's
want to
happening
leave,
within
unlike
UKIP?
all the other parties around here, we do actually have a common position. We want to leave the European Union, and we're campaigning with the different. We're campaigning with the two campaigns likely to.
But it's bizarre, Douglas Carswell,
designation.
that you and Nigel Farage are in two different campaigns. And I ask you again: are you staying within UKIP? Have you have you had, or even discussions about the whip being withdrawn?
I'm 100% UKIP, 100% committed to UKIP,
And to Nigel Farage?
and 100% committed to UKIP. And I think Nigel, as leader of UKIP, is doing a great job. We are 17% in the polls at the moment, but I want us to be on 37% in the polls.
And you don't think he's the man to take that?
Well, no, in order to, in 2 years' time, I would like us to be not on 17% in the polls, but on 27% in the polls. And I think there are some useful suggestions I can make as to how we can best achieve that.
So are you not going to say anything more about the leadership?
I'm not going to say anything more.
Right. Do you regret it then?
I very rarely regret anything I've ever said.
But this could be one of them, Douglas Carswell.
The important thing is that in 6 months' time, we're going to have this referendum, and I think we can win it.
Right. Catsmith, the poll polls put the Remain in the EU campaign 10 points ahead. But as we know from the most recent general election, polls, relying on them, is a very risky business. What will you be doing? What will Labour be doing to encourage people to vote to Remain?
Well, Labour's been very clear right from the outset here that we want to remain part of a reformed EU.
But you're going to remain come what may, whatever the negotiation,
Labour
and that's
will
clear.
be campaigning to stay
Yes.
in the EU. And we'll do that by arguing that being in the EU is better for British workers, is better for British families, and that we're all better off being active members of the EU and playing a part in it at the moment.
And what's your evidence for that?
Cameron
What
very
are the
much
figures that you've got for saying that families are better off within the EU,
well,
that
if you
British
look at
workers are
the
better off?
investment that EU makes in the UK, especially in the example, for instance, in Scotland, where the EU actually supports quite a lot of businesses there. And that's outside of London and the South East, where politics and the media tend to be quite focused. The EU's investing in our regions. If you look in investment,
But we're net
Wales,
contributors to the EU, aren't we, Kat?
But then we're not actually playing our full part. For instance,
we're net contributors, aren't we?
Let her
my
finish.
constituency has been flooded, and there is a EU fund that we could be applying to. And
Well, I'm sure the local MP could lobby their own government.
I am doing. And David Cameron is refusing to engage with the EU, so that we're not actually getting all out of it that we already can.
Or, you say there's momentum, but the poll polls, just for argument's sake, does put the Remain campaign 10 points ahead. And if you think about, we haven't heard from the renegotiation deal yet, the results, there is a European-wide migration crisis, terrorism across the continent, you might think Leave would be doing better, and they're not.
Well, I was looking at some polls recently that put the two camps neck and neck. I think you're right. We need to be a little sceptical of that. I think you're probably right. The Leave campaign is probably at the moment slightly behind, but that's not a bad place to be in. I think momentum is with Leave. We saw senior business figures today, opinion shifting. I think many of the undecideds who are going to decide the outcome are making up their mind that we'd be better off out.
You're so confident that David Cameron is going to get a good deal. Should he resign if, in the end, he loses this referendum?
Well, again, it's an entirely hypothetical question.
Well, it's not hypothetical, because it's happening in a few months' time, potentially.
I expect him to successfully renegotiate Britain's position. And if he does so successfully, then I expect him to win. And what Kat said is right, that people will decide on the basis of their living standards, what's best for their family. But, this is going to be a very tight debate. I think that the two campaigns are neck and neck. Okay. And we're going to see the result of his negotiations, and then everyone makes up their mind.
Thank you for telling us that.